Well, good morning as you get into this new week. We had a great day yesterday at the drive-in service. Lord provided a wonderful day for that. And so as we get into our new week, I want to finish up our study last week on the living the devotional life out of 1 Timothy. Well, we were concentrating around 1 Timothy 6:6. Godliness with contentment is great gain. We looked at all these facets through Timothy. I want to concentrate our time today as we wrap up this study on those last two words, and that is great gain. This is sometimes our most enjoyable part about Bible study and learning about the ways of God is this. What do we get out of it? I mean, that's kind of ever since we were a little kid, we're wondering, what do we get out of it? Well, God says we get plenty. So He says, godliness with contentment is great gain. So I want to talk to you about the dividends that godliness pays out. And we're looking at chapter 4 and verse number 8. Well, we read this last week, but here's what it says. For bodily exercise profits little, but godliness is profitable unto all things, having promise of the life that now is and of that which is to come. So he tells us that godliness has incredible benefit here and in eternity. And so this is this dual effect. I don't just have to wait till I get to heaven to find out, what are the rewards of living for God. God says that will pay plenty in this life. Now I want to tell you, by contrast, ungodliness never pays. It always costs us. And so when we think we're getting ahead or we're getting an advantage through sin, it will always cost us rather than pay us. Think about a lot of the negatives that come from vice and sin to both the body and the soul. You've seen those commercials from smoking cigarettes, and they'll show the cancer patients and so forth that are a result of the havoc that cigarette smoking has wreaked upon somebody's body. Or when I was a kid, those frying pans with the eggs in there, and they would say, this is your brain on drugs. And so those things are real. And so they're showing us some of the real effects that sin and certain behaviors can wreak upon the body. And we know those same things can wreak ungodliness can wreak in the soul. When you look at some of the havocs, it goes for anything from cirrhosis to racism to divorce to greed to adultery to an array of things that can really rip a home or rip an individual's lives to pieces. So ungodliness never pays, it always costs. But listen, it pays to live godly. So let's talk about these two ways. He says the life now and the life that is to come. So let's talk about the present benefits of walking with God and honoring Him in godliness. Psalms 84:11 says this, For the Lord God is a sun and a shield. The Lord will give grace and glory, and no good thing will He withhold from them that walk uprightly. Think about that. God says, you walk with me, I won't withhold anything good from you. Powerful promise. When you read through the book of Proverbs, all that whole book that instructs us on all these activities of life, the way to think, the way to act, the way to speak, and the do's and the don'ts, all those come with great promises, general promises of peace and general promises of protection over our life. So let's name just a few of these specific promises and benefits that come right now for honoring God. Let's begin with what 1 Timothy 6:6 says, and that is contentment. He says godliness with contentment is great gain. Now, having contentment brings great gain to our life, but also contentment is part of the gain. See, since godliness has such a promise to our life of physical, spiritual, even eternal benefit, contentment in God's care is one of the most profound benefits. Isn't it a blessing just to be able to relax, just rest in knowing that God's going to take good care of us? Contentment is one of those great benefits. This is in contrast to that previous verse number 5 of chapter 6, which says this, but he says, perverse disputings of men of corrupt minds, destitute of the truth, supposing that gain is godliness, with such draw yourself away from. He says there's a religion can be a racket. And so there's some people that just look at religion as a way to make money. And he says for that's false teaching, and it's perverted. And so all of those that you see, an array of guys, we know many different names. When it's just a business, that's not godliness. So that's not what God's talking about. He's not putting a dollar figure on it. He's just telling you when you follow God, when you rest in Him and trust Him, there is the incredible benefits that come along, and one of those is contentment. The second benefit we find in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 3, such a basic but a glorious benefit. That fifth commandment that was quoted in Exodus chapter 20, quoted by Paul in Ephesians chapter number 6, He tells us that there's a benefit for honoring your mother and your father. Mother's Day's this week, so church, here's a good way to get a blessing from God as we live out this commandment. He says, when you honor your mother and father, he says, God did something with the fifth commandment He didn't do with any of the others. He gave a promise. He says, when you do this commandment, you actually get a benefit. And what does He say? That it may be well with you, that you may live long on the earth. Now, this is an incredible thing, because some of those Old Testament promises, we think, well, those were just Old Covenant and so forth. But this is Paul who repeats this promise and says the same promise stands, that when you honor, it will be well with you and you may live long upon the earth. And so remember that when you're praying for your health. Let me give you another benefit, and that is power in prayer. You know, James chapter 5 says this, it's the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man that avails much. We know from the psalmist that tells us when we get sin in our life, our prayers are hindered. And so God will not hear us. When a person is walking in godliness, it opens up the prayer line before God. And so that's an incredible benefit to godliness. Then there's the productivity in ministry. When you read in chapter number 4 and verse number 16, he describes at the end of that chapter this to Timothy. He says, take heed to yourself and unto the doctrine, continue in them, for in doing this you shall both save yourself and them that hear you. He said, listen, when you're walking with God and you're making sure what you're preaching and what you're living are the same, when you're practicing godliness, it's going to benefit you. It's going to benefit those who hear you, both other Christians who are encouraged, as well as the lost who are hearing the truth and coming to know Christ. You know, that great passage in Matthew chapter 7, verse number 5, where Jesus is telling us not to be hypocritical. Remember, He says, don't judge the sawdust in somebody else's eye when you got this log in your own eye. He tells us, first of all, take the log out, and when you remove the log, then you can see clearly to help others. This goes along with this. He said, listen, when you are walking godly, not hypocritically, but when you walk in sincerity and godliness, you can actually be used of God in ministry. Then there's another benefit, and that is there's this material benefit and actually a social benefit promised by Jesus in Mark 10, 29 and 30. Remember when Peter says, Lord, we've forsaken everything to follow you? And then Jesus says, there's nobody who's left, houses or families or lands, that shall not, He says, he shall receive 100-fold now in this time. Houses, brethren, sisters, mothers, children, and lands with persecutions. So Jesus says, yes, you've left all these things, but know this. You'll never leave anything behind. You'll never give up anything. That God says, I'll repay you 100-fold in the present life by all of these other things. Your homes, your brothers, sisters, a family, a church family to be part of, even lands, owning material things. Now He throws this in with persecutions. That is, it's not going to be easy as you walk with God to continue to live godly, but as you do, God will provide these even material and social blessings in our life. Then there's another one, that is simply peace from chastisement. You know, when you're honoring God, it just goes to say, God disciplines His children, and so He practices disciplining and chastising His own children. So by just virtue of honoring God and living godly, you get to save yourself the timeouts, the restrictions, and those times when God pulls out the rod of correction. For reference, read Hebrews chapter 12, 2 Samuel 7:14, when God tells David, when Solomon sins, I will chastise him with the rod of men. And so when we're walking with God, there's no reason for those restrictions and those disciplines in our life. That is an incredible benefit to us. And then God invites us into His blessing and deliverances, even when He's dealing with others in our vicinity. That is, why God is bringing judgment. He could be bringing judgment on a family, on a church, on a nation. When He's bringing judgment, in the midst of that, God actually promises, according to the Old Testament, Isaiah 3:10, God is promising all these judgments upon the people who've betrayed Him and are walking in ungodliness. But He says this, but say to the righteous, it shall be well with him, for they shall eat the fruit of their own doing. So God says, tell them, Isaiah, I'm bringing these judgments on the land, but if you're honoring God, no matter what happens to the land, I'm going to take care of you. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 7 through 9. We actually have this repeated in the New Testament. The Scripture is referring to Lot and how God destroyed Sodom, but he protected Lot. And he says this, the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations and reserve the unjust unto the day of judgment to be punished. God knows how to get the right one. Maybe you've heard a parent say, I'm going to whip all of you just to get the right one. God doesn't do that. God's able to deal with perfect wisdom and accuracy, to deal with the unjust and preserve and bless those who walk with Him. I'll tell you another benefit that's not ever talked much about, and that is simply this. There comes this benefit of just being respected in the church. We found this twice in our study in 1 Timothy. You found it in chapter 3, verse 13 as it related to deacons, and chapter 5, verse 9 and 10 as it related to widows, as they were evaluated, and so they were blessed by this respect they had from the church as they walked with God. Now, I want to tell you what, a lot of people don't put a lot of weight upon that, but I want to tell you, there's something good about laying in your bed at night and getting up every morning just knowing you're doing the right thing. You're walking with God. There's a certain nobility that comes from that, and there's a reputation that's built by that, and it's priceless. But then there's two more things I want to close with, and that's these aspects of just pure freedom and enjoyment that comes by doing the right thing. John 8 says, truth sets you free. So when you're living godly, it brings a freedom and a blessing of life. It's kind of like having a recipe, a good recipe, and you get all the ingredients just right, and you get to eat good stuff. God says, when you get these things right in your life and you're putting the pieces together and you're learning to think and speak and act and treat people in the right way and honor God, God says those ingredients will let you feast on a good life. As well, all the way back to where we began, it also insulates us from the natural effects of bad decisions and bad spiritual health. And so it delivers us from greed and racism and all those other things that we talked about. See, godliness in the church is like Samson with his hair. When Samson lost his hair, he lost his power. And when the church loses its godliness, it loses its power. And so the real power behind a Christian witness and ministry and life will be the godliness before our Heavenly Father. And so then there's the second benefit. Those are the benefits in this life, and he says, and the benefits that are perpetual, those to come. Now, let me just kind of give you these in a quick way. There's just a few that we can look back over and so forth. There's not a whole lot of incredible detail on, but we know this. At the judgment seat, there's a benefit for having lived for God. Because as he says, at the judgment seat, when every believer stands before God and we give an account for our life, he says, listen, that gold, silver, precious stones, it will remain. All that wood, hay, and stubble you did, you'll suffer loss. And so just by honoring God, there'll be a benefit at the judgment seat. And then there's a benefit in the kingdom. Remember how Christ describes those entering the kingdom and Him divvying out rewards? He would say, well done, you good and faithful servants. Two marks of godliness, good and faithful servant. And He rewarded them based upon that. And so what is going to come in the kingdom will be a blessing based upon godliness that is lived here in this life. And then third of all, it affects others in eternity. You know, Paul said in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2:19, he says, listen, what is our joy? What is our hope? What's our crown of rejoicing? You in heaven. You when we see you face to face. And so when you honor God and you affect other people's lives, especially winning other people to Christ, you get to enjoy heaven and the benefit for godliness in this life. I want to tell you this very quickly. Heaven is free, but rewards are earned. Never forget that. Now, friend, we'll get to heaven, but if we're going to be rewarded in heaven, the rewards will be based upon godliness and labor upon this earth. You know, have you ever heard a parent tell a child, they'll say things like this, I'm about to leave, but if you behave and you do what you're supposed to do, when I get home, I'll bring you a prize. Now, I want to tell you what, you don't have to tell a kid what a prize is. All they hear is the word prize, and they're ready to comply. But I want to tell you this, God doesn't explain about every single eternal reward that's going to come based upon present godliness. But here's what He does say. He says, through these verses, if you've done what you're supposed to do, when I get you home, I'm going to give you a prize. My friend, who knows what God has in store for people who've walked with Him? The benefits are both present and in the future. You know, here, I want to just leave you with this. You know, one of the greatest benefits of just walking with God and honoring Him with a godly life? Here it is. It's just this, that we get a chance to please God by His grace and by His enablement. That's it. not because of any benefit, any prosperity, any material things. One of the purest benefits is just being able to say, you know what? I'm walking with God. My Creator has saved me by His blood. He's revived me by His Spirit. I'm going to heaven. I get to please Him because He's enabled me to do that very thing by the Spirit of God. And so I encourage you, church, go honor God. It will pay you to do so. Have a great day.